What if some of the foods you consume every day are quietly creating the exact conditions cancer cells need to survive and grow? A few years ago, I came across a statistic that honestly unsettled me more than I expected. Roughly 40% of us will develop cancer at some point in our lives. Not other people, not some distant group, us. And what disturbed me even more was realizing how normal that number has started to feel. Cancer is everywhere now. Almost everyone knows someone who's gone through it. A parent, a friend, a partner, sometimes someone who looked healthy, exercised, ate reasonably well, and still got diagnosed anyway. For the longest time, I thought cancer was mostly a story about bad luck and genetics. Like a hidden flaw buried somewhere in the code of the body that eventually activates without warning. But then, I started reading more deeply into cancer biology, and one idea completely changed the way I think about the disease. Cancer cells don't just appear randomly and grow in isolation. They respond to the environment around them. That idea stayed in my head for weeks, because suddenly, cancer stopped looking like a purely genetic event. It started looking more like a biological ecosystem. An ecosystem shaped by inflammation, hormones, blood sugar, stress signals, immune function, and the constant stream of chemical information created by the foods we eat every single day. And once I saw cancer through that lens, I couldn't unsee it. Some of the foods we casually consume every day, foods marketed as convenient, harmless, even healthy, may be quietly pushing the body toward the exact metabolic conditions that abnormal cells thrive in. Not overnight, not dramatically, but slowly, repeatedly, over years. What fascinated me most was realizing that cancer cells often behave very differently from healthy cells metabolically. They consume energy differently. They respond differently to insulin. They thrive in environments that many modern diets accidentally create all the time. And the deeper I went into the research, the stranger the picture became, because this story isn't just about sugar, or meat, or processed food. It's about the hidden environment inside the human body that most of us never think about until something goes wrong. The moment that idea truly started to click for me was when I began reading about how cancer cells actually use energy. There's a concept in cancer biology called the Warburg effect, and the first time I understood it, I remember just sitting there thinking, why are more people not talking about this? Most healthy cells are incredibly efficient. They use oxygen to slowly extract energy from nutrients in a controlled, stable way. But many cancer cells seem to ignore that system entirely. Instead, they switch into a kind of metabolic overdrive, burning through glucose at unusually high rates even when oxygen is available. It's almost like they're obsessed with fuel, and suddenly, the modern diet started looking very different to me. Because once you notice how much liquid sugar the average person consumes now, soda, energy drinks, sweet coffees, fruit juice, sports drinks, boba, you realize we're exposing the body to massive waves of rapidly absorbed glucose constantly. What makes liquid sugar especially strange is how fast it bypasses the body's normal defenses. There's usually no fiber slowing absorption, no real fullness signal. Just a rapid spike in blood sugar followed by a powerful hormonal response, and that hormonal response matters. Insulin is often talked about as just a blood sugar hormone, but biologically, it's also a growth signal. It tells cells that energy is abundant: grow, store, divide, build. What fascinated me was learning that some cancer cells may contain significantly more insulin receptors than normal cells, making them unusually responsive to that signal. Not because sugar causes cancer in some simplistic way, but because chronically elevated insulin may help create conditions that abnormal cells can exploit. Even fruit juice started looking different to me after that. We tend to associate it with health because it comes from fruit, but once the fiber is stripped away, the body often experiences it more like concentrated sugar than whole food. And then, there's the unsettling reality that certain juices and rice products may also contain traces of inorganic arsenic, a known carcinogen linked to DNA damage over time. The deeper I looked, the more I realized this wasn't about fear. It was about understanding what kind of metabolic environment we're repeatedly creating inside ourselves every day. And honestly, that realization made me start looking beyond sugar and into the broader architecture of the modern food environment itself. Because the more I paid attention to ultra-processed foods, the more they started feeling less like food in the traditional sense and more like engineered biological experiences. That sounds dramatic, I know, but think about how many products today are specifically designed to be irresistibly rewarding. The texture, the salt, the sweetness, the crunch, the convenience, everything is optimized to keep us coming back for another bite before the brain even has time to register fullness. And what unsettled me wasn't just the calorie density. It was the pattern these foods seem to create inside the body over time. Large studies have consistently found associations between higher ultra-processed food intake and increased cancer risk, especially colorectal cancer, which has been rising at surprisingly fast rates in younger adults. And while observational studies can't prove direct causation, the biology behind the pattern becomes difficult to ignore once you start connecting the dots. These foods tend to repeatedly spike blood sugar, reinforce chronically elevated insulin signaling, and contribute to low-grade inflammation that can quietly persist for years without obvious symptoms. I think that's what makes inflammation so deceptive. It's often invisible until the damage has been accumulating for a very long time. Then, there's the gut microbiome, which I've become kind of obsessed with lately because it seems connected to almost everything. Trillions of bacteria living inside us, constantly interacting with the immune system, influencing metabolism, even affecting how the body responds to disease. And many ultra-processed foods contain additives, like emulsifiers, that may disrupt the intestinal barrier and alter the balance of gut bacteria in ways researchers are still trying to fully understand. But maybe the most important insight for me was this: ultra-processed foods don't just add harmful things to the diet, they also replace protective ones. The more room processed foods take up, the less room there is for fiber, legumes, vegetables, resistant starches, phytonutrients, and all the compounds that help regulate inflammation and support healthy gut bacteria. At some point, I stopped thinking about nutrition as isolated ingredients. I started thinking about ecosystems. Because the body seems to respond to dietary patterns far more than single foods in isolation. And that shift in perspective completely changed the way I started thinking about one of the most controversial foods in nutrition: red meat. The internet tends to treat this topic like a war. Either red meat is dangerous and should be avoided completely, or all concerns about it are dismissed as overhyped nonsense. But the deeper I dug into the research, the more frustrating those extremes became, because the actual science feels far more layered than the headlines people argue over. One thing that became very clear very quickly is that processed meat and unprocessed red meat should not be treated as identical foods. Bacon, sausage, hot dogs, deli meats, these products consistently show stronger associations with colorectal cancer across large studies. And biologically, there are plausible reasons why. Processed meats often contain nitrates and nitrites used for curing and preservation. Inside the acidic environment of the stomach, these compounds can form nitrosamines, chemicals known to damage DNA. That connection is one reason processed meat has been classified as a Group 1 carcinogen. But unprocessed red meat exists in a much grayer area scientifically. There are still associations with certain cancers, particularly colorectal cancer, but the evidence is weaker and much more debated. And honestly, learning how nutritional science actually works made me realize why these conversations become so confusing. Cancer takes years, sometimes decades, to develop, so researchers can't realistically lock thousands of people into perfectly controlled diets for 30 years. Instead, Much of the evidence comes from observational studies that track eating patterns over long periods of time. The problem is that human lives are messy. People who eat large amounts of red meat may also differ in sleep, exercise, smoking habits, alcohol intake, vegetable consumption, stress, or dozens of other variables that are difficult to fully isolate. But what fascinated me most wasn't just the debate around meat itself. It was the recurring role of fiber. Study after study keeps pointing toward fiber as one of the strongest protective factors for colon health. Fiber feeds beneficial gut bacteria, supports the production of anti-inflammatory compounds like butyrate, and may help counterbalance some of the biological stress linked to high meat intake. Which made me start wondering if the real issue isn't always what's being added to the diet, but what quietly disappears from it over time. And the more I thought about that idea, the more I realized this entire conversation about cancer and food may ultimately come down to the environments we repeatedly create inside our bodies over time. Not perfection, not fear, not obsessing over one meal or one ingredient. Patterns? That's the word I keep coming back to. Because when you zoom out and look at the biology as a whole, the body seems to respond less to isolated moments and more to repeated signals sustained across years. Repeated inflammation, repeated insulin surges, repeated nutrient deficiencies, repeated disruption of the gut microbiome. Tiny biological pressures accumulating quietly in the background while everyday life keeps moving forward. And I think that's partly why cancer feels so mysterious to people. The disease often appears suddenly, but many of the conditions that may support its development can exist silently for decades before anything becomes visible. That idea honestly changed the way I look at health. I used to think nutrition was mostly about weight. Calories in, calories out, maybe cholesterol, maybe blood sugar if someone developed diabetes. But the deeper I went into cancer biology, the more interconnected everything started to feel. Hormones communicating with immune cells, gut bacteria influencing inflammation, food affecting cellular signaling pathways that most of us never even think about. The human body started looking less like a machine and more like an ecosystem constantly adapting to its surroundings. And what I find strangely hopeful is that ecosystems respond to gradual change. No single food guarantees disease, just like no single superfood guarantees protection. Biology is rarely that simple, but daily habits absolutely shape the internal conditions our cells are exposed to over time. That doesn't mean living in fear of food. If anything, I think fear makes people lose perspective. For me, this topic became less about restriction and more about awareness, about understanding that the body is always listening. Every meal, every habit, every pattern sends information into a system that is incredibly dynamic and unbelievably complex. And honestly, the more I learn about cancer, the less I see food as entertainment alone. I see it as one of the most powerful ways we communicate with our biology every single day. What stayed with me most after exploring all of this is the realization that health is rarely shaped by one dramatic choice. It's usually built quietly through small patterns repeated every day. The food we eat influences far more than weight. It affects inflammation, hormones, gut health, and the internal environment our cells live in. And while no diet can eliminate all risk, becoming more aware of the signals we constantly send to our bodies can genuinely change the direction of our long-term health. Maybe the goal isn't perfection, but creating a biological environment that consistently supports resilience instead of dysfunction. What's one food habit you started questioning or changing recently after learning more about health and nutrition? I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So leave a comment below and let everyone share perspectives and experiences together. And if you enjoy exploring biology, health, and science through this kind of deeper lens, make sure to subscribe and support the channel so I can keep creating more thoughtful videos like this.